Out tonight. We're very happy to have Dr. Mike Orbach here, who Mike was at Duke for many years, the bulk of his career, and now has come back and kind of almost a neighbor of mine in Santa Cruz, and is still heavily involved in the marine policy space, a number of committees, and some of you think there might be one or two people who might remember the talk that he gave, was it last year? It was 2 years ago. It was last year, yeah, on his work with the Louisiana group that was doing a master plan for kind of climate adaptation, really, in the kind of Gulf area there. But Mike's going to talk to us about something much different that has a broader international scope today. And so let's give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Jason. So it's nice to be back here. I ran a professional master's program at Duke for 30 years, and one of the disadvantages of retiring is I miss all those folks, so I'd like to see them refresh anything. That's good. I'm going to talk, but with respect to Louisiana, it wasn't anyone here last year when I talked about Louisiana. This was the development of the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan for the next 50 years. The problem being that there will be no South Louisiana in 50 years. And so the question is how to get Louisiana to deal with that. And if you're interested in what the outcome was, just Google Louisiana Coastal Master Plan and it will come up, because it came out in April of this year. So you'll see the results of a long story I told last time. So tonight I'm going to talk about something different. You all know the concept of marine protected areas, marine managed areas, you've heard those terms. I was involved with a program funded by the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is not just what happened in the field sites we had in Belize, Brazil, Fiji, and Panama, but how the program came about. You know, one of the things you tend not to get in textbooks and professional articles is how the hell anything was generated. You know, you say, well, this happened in the marine protected area, and they saved fish, or they didn't do that. The question is, where did everything come from to do all this work in the first place? And usually that's not written about. Well, what we did with this program is to write it all down, courtesy of a PhD student of mine who both worked on the program and studied it, which is Greg. And so the results of all this were not just the two articles that I suggested for reading, which are the opening article about the genesis of the program and the last article about the lessons from the program. But there were 4 articles in the middle. This was a special issue of the Coastal Management Journal, a special theme issue that came out a couple of years ago. And so what's recorded is the history of the program, how it started, how it was structured, what happened in the 4 countries, and then the lessons. So if you have an interest in the down and dirty about how you really set up a marine managed area in an interdisciplinary context, please go read the 4 country articles, because that's the down and dirty about what actually happened. So marine managed area of the ocean or a combination of land and sea, all human activities are managed for common goals. If done correctly, it will be a form of ecosystem management where all the elements, biophysical, human, and institutional, being the government institutions, are considered together, and that's what we did in this program. So when you're doing one of these programs, it's like doing almost anything else, buying a house. Define the problems or challenges, specify your objectives, develop alternatives, evaluate them and select one, monitor for compliance and meeting objectives, and then revise for adaptive management. This almost never happens this way. Certainly every step doesn't get filled out this way. But this program I'm going to describe to you came pretty close to fitting this model, especially in the interdisciplinary. Now, I myself am an economist and cultural anthropologist, although I finished my career with the title of Professor of Marine Affairs and Policy. So I'm the human dimensions guy. To me, conservation is totally a social process. It's not about biology and chemistry and physics. It's about people and human values and politics and economics and culture. That's what conservation is about. Conservation is only ever about social change. Because if we didn't need social change, if everybody could keep acting the way they want to act, we could all go home. But we can't. Why? Because we need somebody to change. Not the fish, the people. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. You'll see how this came out of this program here. Things to remember. And again, this is the way things should work, but almost never do. Broad participation from scientists, policymakers, constituents, stakeholders throughout the process. You don't just bring the constituents in 3/4 of the way through and say, how do you like the 5 alternatives we developed? You bring them in the beginning to develop the alternatives with you. Right? So throughout the whole process, interdisciplinary science, and this program came pretty close to what I like to call a mirror image of natural science and social science. Right? They come together. Always trade-offs involved. This is my no free lunch statement. Right? Somebody wins, somebody loses in some way toward your common goals. And nothing is accomplished without compliance and enforcement. And that's particularly important with these marine managed areas, especially the large ones. Now, just the general history of marine managed areas, marine sanctuaries, marine protected areas, whatever we want to term it tonight. This is a slide from probably 20 years ago from World Wildlife Fund for Nature that shows mostly inshore and nearshore protected areas. Now, what's happened, especially in the last decade, is a move toward what they call large, very large marine protected areas. These are ones like the Phoenix Islands, the sanctuary in the Pacific. I'm not going to try to name the Northwest Hawaiian Islands one because I would mess it up. Or the Papua, whatever it is. So these are very large areas that have been established now essentially in every ocean and in the Antarctic with Calamar. So this is kind of where we're going with this ocean protection business. Now, I'll emphasize that this is not an initiative that deals with how to deal with all activities in the ocean. It's how to set some areas aside. And the problem with that is that I tell all my environmentalist friends who are behind this movement, which I'm behind in many ways, that I'll give them 30% of the ocean, even totally protected. That won't matter in the end unless we manage what we do in the other 70% of the ocean. And one of my concerns is effort gets funneled so much off in the marine protected areas that we're not doing the basic management of other things, shipping, fishing, offshore energy, pharmaceuticals from ocean products, those kinds of things. But this is what's happening. So this is the chart that came out of a group from the University of Washington that recently had a big meeting talking about this phenomenon. And what this chart does is you see in the little red and yellow and tan areas are these very large protected areas that are either proposed and implemented by governments or NGOs. But what it overlays on are the exclusive economic zones of the nations of the world, which comprise about 40% of the world ocean, but only 40%. And what I'm going to say in a minute equally applies to exclusive economic zones as it does to these very large protected areas, and that is this. That there are two big problems. That many areas, frankly including exclusive economic zones, which are kind of a big meat axe thing that came out of the Law of the Sea Convention, have been established without what I call a fully found process, based on science, public constituent input, and transparent public policy making. That's the first problem, especially with some of these very large protected areas. Now this includes, by the way, the Marine Sanctuary Program in the United States, with our beautiful Monterey Bay Sanctuary here. This was set up to be a program where people would nominate sites to NOAA, and NOAA would have a big set of criteria, go through that whole list that I've been doing before. In fact, almost all the major ones were produced through congressional legislation. Simply a political process, where somebody went to their congressman and said, I want a protected area here, and Congress said, okay, thou shalt be a protected area. Often without any appropriations to run it, which is the second problem. And that is, many of these areas, no matter what you call them, don't have the monitoring, compliance, enforcement, or management capability to achieve their objectives. Now that's true for a lot of countries, EEZs, especially the small island developing states, for example, in the Pacific, or less developed countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America. They have these areas, 200 miles, but they don't have the ability to really monitor what's going on out there in those areas. And that's true a lot of times with the marine managed areas as well. So what I'm going to give you is an example of what I think is a case where we try to avoid these problems, courtesy of a fair amount of resources that came our way. So this was a project that, a 5-year project, went from 2005 to 2010, major field sites in Belize, Brazil, Fiji, and Panama. The way it started is that in 2002, a woman named Sylvia Earle, who some of you may know, got together with a fellow named Gordon Moore, who you may know. Anybody know who Gordon Moore is? What's he associated with?
Intel?
Yes, he founded Intel Corporation. He doesn't work at McDonald's anymore, right? And it's the famous Moore's Law, computer power doubles every 2 years, whatever it is. So he and Sylvia Earle had met, and she said, Gordon, we need to bring people together to have a plan to save the ocean. So this became to be the Define Oceans In Conference in Cabo San Lucas in Baja in 2002. They brought 60 what were considered ocean experts from around the world. They made one mistake, they invited me, and I was the head of the ocean governance theme of this group. And we came up with a publication on how to do research and what management measures might be necessary, and how much it was going to cost. Gordon, being a business guy, brought some friends from Goldman Sachs. Yay, boo. So Goldman Sachs people came, and they followed everybody around saying, how much is this going to cost, what you're talking about? And we costed it out. And if you Google Defying Oceans In, you can see how much we said it was going to cost. And it was in the trillions of dollars. Everybody said, oh, we can't tell them it's going to cost trillions of dollars, because then nobody will want to do it. And I kept saying, do you know how much one B-1 bomber costs? Right? It's like, I talked to Kristen earlier, there's never no money. It's just a matter of where it's going. And so anyway, we came up with this product from this meeting. So after that, Sylvia and Gordon got together and said, well, what are we going to do as kind of an example of the kinds of things we should be doing? And they came up with something called the Marine Managed Area Science Program that Gordon agreed to fund from the Gedney Gordon and Moore Foundation for $12.5 million for 5 years. And it was funded through Conservation International, a major NGO based in Washington, D.C. And it was called the Gordon and Moore Foundation. The program it was funded under was the Gordon and Moore Foundation Marine Conservation Initiative. $12 million over 5 years. It was decided it should be a case-based program. So it just wasn't theory about this or that. Let's actually create some change in specific places and be culturally and politically and economically specific to the context in each of those places. So we ended up doing baseline studies across all the disciplines. We had in-country facilitators and consensus builders who worked with the policymakers in each of the countries. So we were just kind of assisting the in-country people in these cases, which is not a common thing for American consultants to do. We developed long-term monitoring protocols across all the disciplines, and we did a series of management effectiveness studies to say, well, what happened? What was the result of what we did? There was, in terms of the project organization, you know, how do you, so CI gets $12.5 million and said, you know, who's going to do this? And so they got this fellow, Les Kaufman, from Boston University, a conservationist, to be the principal investigator, the guy who's theoretically responsible for the academic part of it. They hired an ex-PhD student of mine, Leah Carr, to, and she loves this term, be the director of marine managed area science, both natural and social science. And then she hired 2 assistant directors, one for biophysical and one for social science, who in fact ran those separate things. But reporting to her, as the integrated director of the program. We had in-country coordinators in each of the countries. They were just very experienced people in many different ways, but they were very different from each other in all 4 of the countries. And then we had cross-node disciplinary coordinators that coordinated the biophysical, socioeconomic, and economic evaluation work in each of the countries. I was the socioeconomic and governance coordinator, theme coordinator for these different countries. We ended up involving over the course of the program 100 scientists and stakeholders directly, that is funding them, having them been principals with us. Another 300 indirectly. Partnerships with 75 institutions at all different scales. 52 specific coherent studies were funded through over 100 grants and sub-grants. It's quite a thing to manage this amount of money. And frankly, Leah, when she went on with Conservation International, had to have them hire on a whole accounting and management staff to keep track of all of this, because this is quite a lot of things. And Jason is probably a wonderful administrator, but I think he and I would both admit, when we were in graduate school, they didn't train us to manage a $12 million 5-year program. This involves something you never hear in an environmental state program, is how to do that. So the part of the question is how to figure out how to do all that. We had a scientific advisory committee. I won't go through all of them, but they were very international, from the US, from Australia, from Malaysia. Now, I want to give you a sense. One of the problems with trying to help someone develop policy is letting them actually do it. And as a cultural anthropologist, what that means to me is you have to go to a place and you have to spend time in the place and you have to be with the people in the place. And I knew I couldn't do that as a social scientist, as an anthropologist. So these were my in-country folks who I recruited to be the local people to actually do and direct the research that I was supposed to be responsible for in this program. So on the left is Joeli Vitiaki from Fiji. He's from one of the chiefly clans there who actually, they weren't chiefs so much as advisors to chiefs. And he's a cultural anthropologist, but was the head of the marine science program at the University of the South Pacific in Sula. Next to him is Dolores Cordero, who's actually a full professor chemist at the University of Panama. But she's a native Panamanian, mixed race, and she's started the Institute for Traditional and Ethnic Studies at the University of Panama. And so she was our person in Panama. To my left in the picture is Joseph Palacio, who is, have you ever heard of a group called the Garifuna? Anybody heard of Garifuna? So they're a group, they're actually slaves from Africa who were brought to Argentina, shipped to St. Vincent Island in the Caribbean, and were so boisterous, they kept them all together for some reason, they were so boisterous that they put them on 3 sailing ships and told them to go away. And so for 150 years they traveled around the Caribbean and finally settled in southern Belize and northern Honduras. And they're fisher people in the coast of Belize now. Now he's a native Belizean. Joseph is from a town called Monkey River. To this day, has 300 people, no electricity, no running water. Belize has a wonderful education system set up by some rich English guy. And he went through that system, was accepted at UC Berkeley in the 70s, got a PhD in cultural anthropology. He still lives in Monkey River, actually. He's a tremendous guy. He is the expert on belief in the culture of the world. And then the last person is Isabella Corrado, and she is she's a professor of business, actually, at the University of Sao Paulo. And she has done a lot of work in coastal marine research in Brazil. So she was our person in Brazil. So let me talk about what actually happened in each of these countries briefly here. So here's Belize. You see that little red dot? Can you see the red dot in the middle? Or is there a pointer? No. Red dot right there. Okay. So here's the Yucatan Peninsula, there's the Caribbean, or there's Gulf of Mexico, there's the Caribbean, and here's Panama down here. So this is Belize. Belize is ex-British Honduras. It was a colony for many years of Britain, now independent. And it's right at one end of the Mesoamerican Reef. It's a wonder. How many have been to Belize? Must be somebody that. Well, you know, but you've been to Belize. So everything's focusing on it. So it's a beautiful place. They have jaguar preserves. The culture there is a mixture of what they call the Caribes, which are the African descended, the Mestizo and Mayan folks in the Garifuna. In terms of the fishing there, there's a very diverse set of fishing that goes on. But two of the major types of craft are these small sailing boats that you see in the upper left here, and the white things stacked on the deck are dugout canoes. And these are mostly the Mayans who do this from a place called Sartaneja in the north of Belize. And they fish all over the place, mostly for reef fish, and then they sell to the local markets as they go up and down. But the big money in the water in Belize is in the lower right. These are 100-person fast catamarans specially designed for the tourist industry, right? Especially shallow water diving, because there's a lot of shallow water diving that's really wonderful in Belize. This is a big industry and big money. The lower left is one of the old, all these houses are built out of wonderful mahogany scraps. It was translated, this is now a dye shop. The upper right is the entrance to one of the Garifuna towns called Hopkins. They're famous for their music that they have brought over the years with them, and they're famous for their drumming. So it's a drum sculpture that a Garifuna artist made there. So a lot of use of the water for commerce, but recreation is really the dominant use of the water economically in Belize. Now, when each of these places, I'm going to talk about what some of our local connections were. And in these pictures, in the upper left, the woman in the middle is Angeline Valentine. She came from Belize on a grant from a foundation in Europe and did a master's project with us in Duke. But then went back and was hired by the Oak Foundation out of Switzerland that has a big program for Mesoamerican reef to be their Belize coordinator for marine research. And she's still there now. She's married, has 2 children now since this picture. On the lower left is Roberto Pot, who, as it says, is the Belize coordinator for a group called Healthy Reef for Healthy People. It's a local NGO. He also did a master's degree with us at Duke. And then the lower right is Chantal Clark, also a native Belizean, who came and did a master's degree with us and went back and, while it still existed, it's in a different form now, was the head of the Belizean Coastal Management Program. So this was incredibly useful for us, as you might imagine, to have people who were native Belizeans who we knew in those positions in country. And they were incredibly helpful for this project. All right, so this is the coast of Belize, and all in the colored here, the colored pieces here are the marine managed areas, and I mean managed area, not just protected area. You'll see why I say that in a minute. It's areas that are managed. They were developed during the course of the program, and I'm going to just talk about 2 of them. About Gladden Spit, which is here, and Laughing Key, which is here. Have you been to those places?
Close.
All right, okay. But close.
Yes, Tobacco Key.
Tobacco Key. That's a little bit north, I think. So what the lines are, through our interviews with the local fisher folks there, we determined what the fishing migratory patterns were of the fishermen, not the fish, but the fishermen. And so that's what the color lines are. And so we did that so that we could figure out who lived where and who used what marine resource where. So this was kind of the mapping of that. Now, what I want to point out about this is that there is no comprehensive plan, although they have tried and are still trying to put one together for the whole coast of Belize. But they have a substantial number of these protected areas, Holchan, Sapade Caves, a whole bunch of them. But what I want to point about these 2, which were developed in the course of our program, Gladden Spit is an area offshore. Does anybody know what Gladden Spit's famous for? For
lobsters.
No, for snapper grouper spawning aggregations, which attract what? Largest fish in the world. Whale sharks. Yes. And so, because of the spawning aggregations of the snappers and groupers, it's been historically very important for the commercial fishers who talk about placenta. But because of the tourism potential, tourism has kind of taken over economically. So the question is what to do. Now the Gladden Spit is in fact a marine reserve. And this is one of the things you'll find in terms of public policy with all these protected areas. They're all called something different with a different implication of who runs it and what the laws and policies are. So this is called a marine reserve. And the way this green spot is divided up is that they said, okay, look, there's a certain amount of commercial fishing that has gone on here. We're not interested in having a lot more, but we want to be able to have you continue, people in communities who have depended on it in the past, we want to be able to continue to do that. So there's a limited number of licenses to fish in designated subzones of this green area here, which is actually the purple. But then they said, we understand that the major economic draw here, which is also important for a lot of different kinds of people in Belize, is in fact the whale shark dive tourism. And so that's what, nothing else can happen except that in most of that green area. So it was divided up so the commercial fish, and there's a limited number of licenses, they can be passed on, they can be bought and sold, it's a little bit like an ITQ system, but it's for licenses. So it's not really a catch, just who can fish there. So the point is, in that area, we worked that out so the traditional uses, commercial uses can continue, but this rather new leisure tourism use, which is dominant, has a special place as well. Now, Laughing Bird Key here was a different case. Laughing Bird Key is a very small key. What's it like around here? California has no islands. It's like a real squat Catalina island. Half that size. So it's a key. It's got tropical plants on things and a lovely little fringing reef around it. But there had been a proposal, a fellow bought it and proposed to put a huge condominium development on it. And a local group called Friends of Nature developed, in mostly expats but some locals, in Belize to oppose this. In fact, it's the head of that group we recruited to be our in-country coordinator for this program. And so they ultimately, the government ultimately said, no, you can't do it. And actually bought this guy out. And because there had never been a lot of traditional commercial fishing in this area, except for maybe some of the guys in the little lug-out boats, and because there were lots of other places for those guys to fish and they knew it, the government said, okay, and Friends of Nature, the local group, said, we recommend that this become a leisure area only with no structures. So essentially a wilderness type area just for people to go out and do day camping and snorkeling and things like that, because it's very shallow, you need a scuba pack to do it. And so that is what this is. It's Laughing Bird Cay, and it is official marine protected area managed by the Fisheries Department, actually, of Belize. So my point here is that what we did is we worked with the locals to do the science on what these places were like, biophysically and socioeconomically, and politically, with jurisdiction, authority, responsibility, and then we designed the program to fit what the locals wanted to do with their space. And in fact, that's the way it worked out. The people who were prohibited from doing what they used to be doing were these small-scale migrant Mayans from up north, but they didn't protest at all, in part because they said, look, there's hundreds of keys like this. And so fine, you guys go. That's okay with us. We'll go fish somewhere else. That's okay. So this is the summary of Belize. Small marine territory, hundreds of small shallow water keys, very accessible. 3 major ethnic groups fishing, primarily in small craft. Heavy involvement of leisure tourism industry throughout the whole coast. Strong tradition of international and NGO involvement, so Nature Conservancy, everybody and their brother WF has been in Belize because it's an attractive place to go. And relatively strong government institutions, but a clear lack of monitoring enforcement. And in fact, if you go to the, remember I showed the chart with all the EEZs on and said it's not clear people could really manage all that. Even in Belize, outside of those specific areas where there are designated agencies to monitor specific activities, it's well known that there are hundreds of 30 to 50 foot boats that come up from Honduras and fish illegally in the EEZ of Belize all the time, because they don't have the capability to stop that. But they do have the capability to selectively manage these areas that we pick. Okay, let's go to Brazil. So here's Brazil. The dot's hard to see here too. And the dot is right here. And it's right adjacent to this big bank that's now called the Arroyos Bank. It used to be called the Queen Charlotte Bank in the old colonial days, but now it's called Arroyos. And this is just a lovely but rather remote area of eastern Brazil. And what's interesting to note about this picture, courtesy, of course, of little Middlebury, is the very light green in the whole eastern half of Brazil. That's essentially all deforested land, where the natural forest has all been totally cut down, and it's used now for eucalyptus growing, mostly for pulp and paper. So it's tremendous ecological change on the land. But beautiful little estuaries all up and down the coast. And the fishing that goes on there varies anywhere from dugout canoes with little boats that come up with the tide every day. The tide's about 3 meters there, as you see in the upper left. The majority of the boats that fish in this part of Brazil who are local are the ones you see in the lower right. This is a gillnet long lining boat that because of the tidal thing, you guys just leave them there, and they have those so they don't fall over when the tide goes out. What would you call those? These just things right there. They're like little fins that come out of the boat, but they're so the boat can rest and won't fall over. If the tide goes out, and they can work in the boat. When the tide goes back, and they go fishing. Personal application. And again, mostly longliners and gillnetters. I put this picture of the lower left, the one in the middle. You can see this, but it has to do with local culture. North of here, in the Amazon, you ever heard of the pink river dolphins from the Amazon? All right, well, that's what this is in the bottom of the picture. And you can see this dolphin swimming along, and there's a community of people there. The dolphin has a sombrero on, and he's called Senor Dolphin. And the reason this character exists in local culture is that when young unmarried women get pregnant, what everyone says is, Senor Dolphin. Now, I don't know where to go with that. It's just local culture, right? Everybody loves talking about this. And I'll get back to this other picture in a minute. So, in the upper left were my traveling companions for a lot of the time that I was in Brazil. In the middle you see Isabella, and to the left and right are Maria and Carolina Neves. And the lower right is Albino Neves. The reason they're important is that Albino started a local fishermen's cooperative in this quite remote place. One of the problems was that fishermen with bigger boats from other parts of Brazil would come and fish essentially illegally in their area, there, in the area around where I showed you here. And he formed this local association to try to get the government to do something to protect local fishermen. And his wife Maria was very instrumental. The house, the little building that the association has is on their property, which is quite remote property. It's just, in fact, their property is up around that last point up there. The reason we were here
is that we were taking them home, and if we had, and they walked back to their house, which is right around that point, because had we tried to drive there, because of the lack of roads in this part of Brazil, it would have taken 5 hours to drive to that point. You can see it there. So they said, no, leave us here, we'll walk. So we buy it now. So, but Maria would come, so Albino was a very good local connection with the fishermen, and we said, again, what are your objectives here? And they said, well, we want to keep fishing here, but these bigger boats are coming from other places, and they're taking all the fish, and they're trawling, and they're swimming around, and blah, blah, blah. So, Albino was very important working with fishermen. Maria was incredibly important in dealing with the fishing families in these communities that we visited. Right? And Carolina came along largely to look after this little person whose dress is pulled up here, and this is Anatella, who was Isabella's 2-year-old daughter. Now let me tell you, if you want to develop a relationship with a local community in this part of Brazil, go with a cute 2-year-old. And we were unabashed in doing that, right? Which is why we needed Carolina, because when we started talking to people, Anatella would wander off, and so Carolina went with her, and sometimes we didn't see them the rest of the day. But it was okay, because it was an entree into the community, because there's some sense that you mean you're kidding me when you're working. You're nice. You're real people. We're real people too. Let's talk. Right? And it worked out actually very well. These kids, by the way, are Patixo, P-A-T-I-X-O, indigenous people from this area of Brazil. They fish in the inshore area, largely with very small, it's kind of like beach seine nets for shrimp that come in out of the estuary. And they were doing this was in December, they were doing a Christmas celebration. That's why they're all dressed up. But they thought little Anatella looks great. We did the whole night. We did our work with their interviews. So here's the situation in Brazil. The area where the Patixos are, where those pictures were taken, is the middle longitudinal red line up there. They're in that estuary. And so there were several areas we were involved in, but there were 2 main ones. One was that area there. And in that green area, Isabella's husband, Alexandre, was the head of the Indigenous Peoples Program in the Amazon for an agency called IBAMA. And he came up with the idea of an extractive reserve. So a reserve area that's set off, but you allow some controlled extraction. He came up with that idea with natives in the Amazon to help them control their own land from the large logging companies. And so one night, Isabella and Alexandre were talking, and he said to her, why don't you do an extractive reserve at the coast, like we do in the Amazon? And she went, well. So that's where the idea came from. So this is called the Corumbau Extractive Reserve. And the way it works is because in Brazil, fishing is very government controlled. That is, there are all fishermen in Brazil are licensed by the government, by the federal government, because there is no state waters equivalent in Brazil. The federal government controls all the water. The U.S. is very odd in that way. And so all fishermen have to have a government license. And they're all essentially unionized in what they call guilds of fishermen by village across the whole coast of Brazil, to the point where if a fisherman gets hurt or if there's something wrong with his boat and he can't work for a while, the government essentially pays you fisherman's unemployment. Right? And that seems to work for everybody. But the artifact was they've got great lists of who lives where and who fishes where, right, in Brazil. So when the local community said this, and this estuary is a lovely estuary here, and this is where a lot of these big trawlers were coming in and coming right up in the estuary. So they said, well, up here, why don't we do this? Why don't we say no trawling, and you have to be from one of these local communities to actually fish in these areas, and you have to use traditional gear. and they defined what traditional gear was in traditional amounts. And so that's the way this system works now. By the way, I'll say it now, but it's true for all of our locations. We were able to get basically a baseline of the fish, the habitat, and the general characteristics of the community and the fishing before this went all into place, and then after it went into place. And in all cases, we can truly say that the environment got better and the socioeconomic situation got better. So, but that worked out as an extractive reserve. Now this is the Emeritus National Park. This is probably 50 kilometers offshore, so 30 miles, something like that, right? And the only people who fished out here were these migratory fishermen, the same guys who would come in and scope this area up here. But they're loved eyes with beautiful, deep coral reefs. It's really 400 feet deep out there. But these two areas are famous for these deep coral reefs. So what happened in those areas is they are now a national park, the Emeritus National Park. And there's no commercial activity all involved except for recreational dive companies that take people on boats like I showed you in Belize out there to dive. So these areas were set off as completely no commercial take, recreational only. And this area was set up as an area basically to benefit local fishers and protect the environment, including local fishers, including the Pacho indigenous community. Okay, so remote area of Brazil, but heavily used marine area by people from there and from outside. Strong tradition of government involvement, as I described. Significant involvement in international NGOs in Brazil, including Conservation International had already had an office here in this area, in a town called Caravelas. And policy adapted to both international leisure tourism and local commercial interests, as of course was the case with Venezuela and Belize. This is me working hard at the end of the day. And this is in Cordoba. I won't go on about the food in Brazil. How many of you been to Brazil? They have great food there, and there's juices.
I got to go to the Orbach National Park.
Oh, did you? You went to Boros, out to the Big Island?
Just a place where you can do diving.
Yeah. Brazil's great. I never had juice from a can in Brazil. They pride themselves on fresh squeezing every drop of juice you drink.
Did they tell you why it's named Orbach?
No.
It means
Somebody did, but I can't remember.
Abriolhos because ships used to crash into the reefs and sink. So it's Abriolhos, like open your eyes, watch out.
I had not heard that.
Surprised.
Thank you.
Surprised they never explained that to me.
No, that's very interesting. Oh, I could call these about.
And these coral structures you're talking about, they're very old, and they're called chapéus, which is like hats, because they grow up and they sort of look like these big hats coming over the
I knew that.
Yeah.
I like the other thing though, it's supposed to be anthropology.
Hopefully it's true.
You know lots of guys.
Just a few, yeah.
Okay, so let's go to Fiji. You know, I co-taught a class here with Claire Kyler with the Center for Ocean Solutions in Middlebury this summer. And the reason Fiji is here. And the reason this picture is oriented this way is there were a lot of Chinese students in this class. And I wanted them to orient Fiji to China. This was the best I could do with people learning. So anyway, this is Fiji, Pacific island, in the Polynesian island, high island, I don't know, low atoll, high island. Lots of wonderful fisheries, both pelagic and reef fish there. Had been a British colony for many years, now independent. And actually it's good that I have this picture this way because Fiji, in terms of the way they view their place in the world, doesn't think a bit about the United States and Latin America or Europe. They think about New Zealand, Australia, and Southeast Asia. That's their world. It's not us. It's a different world.
So here you see some of the local reef fish in the middle picture in the top, mostly caught by local fishers. But then there's the large pelagic longliners for tuna, which is the lower center picture. And they make a lot of money out of licensing for these offshore tuna fisheries. I'll get back to the picture on the lower left, but the upper left is a fellow looking out toward the reef. And there's a system that I'll get back to in a minute called the Ungoli system, which is a traditional reef tenure system tied to the local villages who are adjacent to the lagoons and the reefs. And the little tiny dot you can see in the middle of the picture is a ship that was sunk in the coral, actually, after the Second War, and it's still out there. So this is the whole lagoon is under the control of the local village that this fellow's looking out at. The top right are some local villages, but Fijians, they're so great. These ladies heard we were having meetings there at the university, and they came in every day from miles away and cooked us on site the most scrumptious food. So, in terms of local things, this is Joelle and I wearing our sulus. The sulu is the Fijian sarong, basically, the males wear. But they're really cool because they have pockets. Nice and carry stuff, they're very packed. And it's hot there. So. Now the reason we're looking slightly glazed is that this is what we have been doing. Somebody recognized it. This is kava. So kava is a root, and it's a mild kind of anesthetic, narcotic feel that you get. And what they do is they take these beautiful big wooden bowls that have these legs on them here, and they pound some of this root with water until basically it's muddy water, but it's kava water. And then a fellow, and the guy who ended up doing it was the guy in pink here. He takes a half a coconut, and it's not hallucinogenic. It's not. How many of you ate that kava? All right, so you know it's not. How would you describe it? The effect of kava?
That's sleepy.
Yeah, some people get sleepy. Sometimes they thought like this. Sometimes they drink beer, sometimes they don't. But it's a very important local cultural phenomenon. This is why I thought I would put this in here. Is that Joelle said, okay, you guys, the first thing we got to do now that you're visiting is we got to go have some kava with this. It's actually the village that I showed you the picture of the guy looking out. And so they mash all this stuff up, and we're all sitting around on a big circle of mats. And then they take it in a half a coconut, and the guy comes in and he offers some to the highest status person there, which in this case was the chief of the village. And he goes up, and everybody claps twice. And then you have to drink the whole thing down, and everybody claps again. And then he goes back, and then he goes down the road. Next was Joelle as the honored local guest. Next was me as the honored guy from off, right? And so we did this for a couple of hours, and after that we had the greatest interviews with everybody. No, not that night, but after that. My point is, connections with locals, if you're doing something from the bottom up, are real important. It takes time, and it takes melding in with the local cultures. Okay, so just quickly here, in Fiji, the task ended up being kind of easy because all these little round circles you see are the traditional ngoli-goli, where the villages controlled basically the fishing offshore of their villages. Now, when the British came in and took over Fiji, they created a national fisheries department and tried to create licenses for fishing that the federal government issued. But what happened was, and they tried to break down the ngoli-goli system because there was no central control. They being British. Right? So what happened was, it turned out that you did have to get a license because there were these guys who would go out and ask for their license from the British government. But if the local ngoli-goli chief didn't say you got a license, you didn't get a license. So in fact, the system remained under total control of these local chiefs in terms of the licensing of it. But it did break down a bit from the British period. What we did is to say, and Joelle was very instrumental, is we said, do your ngoli-goli system again.
Now, the interesting part about that was that golis are managed areas, and they have certain, called kaput, no-take areas, where you can't take anything most of the time. But if there's a special ceremony, a chief dies, or a chief has a granddaughter born, or something, they'll open them up to get fish for the feast. And then they'll close them again. And mostly they stay closed. This drove the biologists on our team nuts. They said, they've got to be closed all the time. And the Fijians would say, well, you know, the fish come back when we close them, which of course is true. And they come back very quickly because it's a very fecund sort of ecosystem. And so the biologists just kind of wandered off into the night mumbling to themselves because they just thought this was terrible. The Fijians said, and we said to the Fijians, yeah, do it that way again. It's fine. So that's what they do. Okay, strong historic tradition, failed attempt to centralize policy, local NGO organization, there's a group called FLEMA, the Fijian Local Marine Managed Area Association, and believe you me, nobody talks to you in Fiji unless FLEMA says you're okay. So there's a centralized local NGO, not the government, that controls who gets to do what in Fiji. We hired the head of that group as our in-country coordinator, which worked out very well. But we were doing something she liked too, so that was good. And I won't get into the last one. All right, the last one, Panama. So here's Panama. You can see this red dot here. You know where Panama is. And this is Coiba Island, and it's about 50 kilometers offshore in the Gulf of Chiriquí, up in northwest Panama. And the fishing, nobody lives on these islands for a reason I'll explain in a minute. And they fish mostly with boats like you see in the upper right, and they fish from land, but they fish out around these islands because they're very productive out in the Gulf of Panama. You get out there in these little boats like in the lower left, I tell you, it's quite a nice trip because it's, I don't want to say nice, it's quite an interesting trip because it's an open boat, it's 30 miles offshore. It's an interesting trip. But the fishing, nobody lives on the islands. They all fish historically from the land. And they go 30 miles offshore to do it. Now, this is not hard to translate. It says, hello, good day, from the Ecological Police of Coiba. Now, this building, here's the story of Coiba. Coiba, it was a privately owned island. For the last 100 years, was a penal colony. It's where Panama sent their worst, baddest criminals. But there was no prison building. They let them wander around and kind of camp around the island. But to make sure their buddies wouldn't come get them on boats, they very strictly patrolled a 10-kilometer strip around the island, thereby making it a de facto total protected area for 100 years. I defy you to find another coastal area in the world that has that situation. So in 2004, the government decided they were going to abandon, just before we started the project, they were going to abandon the penal colony. And every developer in Latin America went nuts. Because this island, it has alligators all over the place, it has macaque hairs flying through the air, it has 2 species of monkeys, it's just this beautiful island. We went diving and there were hundreds of lemon sharks and green turtles and it's just this great place. And the developers really wanted to get it. But a group of NGOs came in and started to lobby for it to be a protected area. Okay? Said, no, this is a great place, it's a unique place, you can't do this. And they eventually got the Panamanian legislature to pass a law saying it will in fact be a protected area. And it's still privately owned, but when the last descendant of the owning family passed away, and they deeded the whole thing to the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, which is in Panama, part of the Smithsonian in the U.S. So they manage it. That's a long story how it happened. But what happened here was, now remember, nobody lived on this island. There were prisoners, but they fished. And this dotted line here is the historic 10-kilometer protected area where nobody could come pick up bad guys. And people came from the mainland to fish out here, mostly on this side of the island. Well, here what happened was, the local fishermen's group from the coast, there's a lot of development, leisure tourism development on this coast here. And so most of the fishermen don't fish all year. They fish sometimes when there's not construction work. But there's a lot of construction work. So they don't actually depend all that much on the fishing. But when the thing was designated a park, there immediately grew up a huge recreational fishing industry. And there's a little group of primitive huts on the north end of the island, but it's clear there will be no further structures on the island. But what they do is under certain limited licenses, these people tow out these barges that are probably half the size of this room. They have several bedrooms, a bathroom, and a huge liquor bar. And people pay copious amounts of money to fly out there in seaplanes, live on these barges, and take these 30-foot fishing boats, twin outboard fishing boats, out for the lovely fishing that's in this area, but it's all no-take recreational fishing. So what was decided here, and it was decided by a council of people from the government, from the NGOs, and the land here, was that this would also be an area primarily for recreation. And they decided that there are only about 40 licenses to fish out there, commercially. And so what they decided was they eventually wanted to eliminate total. So the rule is there are 40 people, not probably 20 now, who have these licenses, but if they got out of the fishery, or if the boat sank, or if anything happened, the license extinguished. So they decided here to go total leisure tourism and no commercial take at all in this whole area. And this is a proposal to expand the original predicted area to this area, essentially doubling its size. So very different outfit here. But again, tailored to the local circumstance. Remote specialized, heavy national angle participation, decision to phase out commercial fishing, and allocation essentially to leisure and tourism. Now, what came out of this? Well, the assistance came out of this. Now, it wasn't we didn't do this, the local people did this. We just helped them with the science in paying the facilitators and anything else they needed to do what they wanted to do in these 4 countries. But we put out synthesis of each country, that's what's in the articles I mentioned to you, interdisciplinary syntheses, a whole number of science to action products. It says, here's what the science found, here's what you could do with it one way or the other. And then on the ground, the MMAs were established, long-term adaptive monitoring. Here are the conclusions. Yeah, there are more bigger fish if you don't fish in some areas. Big surprise. We shouldn't spend a nickel on any of that research anymore. People are always affected, that's the issue. The question is how, and how do you fit into the needs of the people? Specific goals are hard to clarify, but we tried our best, and we did a pretty good job with this. Monitoring enforcement and critical, often the downfall. Context, and all the ways I tried to display with the special little pictures here, are important to get things done in these places with people. Continuous stakeholder involvement is crucial. And in the end, these were relatively small places. These countries all have 200-mile EEZs, all of which should be completely managed. So that's why I say they have to be nested. In the end, to make ocean conservation work, they have to be nested in a larger system. Okay, here's what you should do. You mostly did that. All of the cases were, by our scientific monitoring, successful because we did this broadly interdisciplinary research from the beginning, so we could say what changed and how in these cases. We used totally in-country facilitators. Now researchers, there were some researchers like myself who were from outside. The people on the ground doing the work were all people from the country. They all included some no-take areas, but were essentially bounded in spatial plans. That's what these things turn out to be. And it's all about people. Thank you very much.
Which of the 4 places do you live?
All,
All of them? Yeah, this actually was hard duty, because I had to visit all.
They consume a lot of narcotics and alcohol. Just joking.
Well, speaking of narcotics, one of the funniest things, remember the sailboats with the dugout canoes and believe? Well, those are mostly Mayans from northern Belize. And a lot of people had migrated in, there are hundreds of these boats. And we couldn't figure out why there were so many, because the reefs are actually a little overfished in northern Belize. And we couldn't figure out why there were so many of these fishermen out there. And finally, over beers one night, in Sartaneja, some guy said, well, we're all hoping to catch the white grouper. What's the white grouper? Packages of cocaine that fall off the drug boats and float because they're sealed, so that it will tempt cocaine. And so every once in a while, one of these little boats out there finds a pack of cocaine, and their entire village is set for life. And that's why there's so many fishermen. Yeah.
Speaking of money things, what do you have a sense of what the economic impact of deciding to let go of the commercial fishing and those licenses and all of those sort of choices? How are these places doing now economically with opting for just leisure tourism or any of those?
Well, remember, the only one that opted totally for leisure tourism was Coahuila.
Okay.
All the others protected the local traditional commercial fishing. And in fact, if you look in those individual articles, there are outcomes listed by disciplinary category. Yeah. And they're all, there was, you know, we did opinion and perception surveys as well, and the commercial fishers, because of the reputation of marine protected areas, right, about just preserving things, not caring about the people saying, they were uniformly afraid of what was going to happen. But uniformly, they are all better off because of the way the system is designed, and they said that. But they were all very cautious, if not against it in the beginning. Well, thank you very much. I'm easy to find on the web. If you carry cards anymore, I'm easy to Google. So if you'd like to talk or find out anything else, please give me a call.
Yeah, and we'll hang out a few minutes if anyone wants to introduce themselves. Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you.